our 6th whiskey tasting session. It's very good to have you join us here again. So for this whiskey tasting session, I invite you to learn about and try some of our Welsh whiskies and some of our Scotch. For this whiskey tasting session, I invite you to try Penderyn Legend and Penderyn Myth, which are both Welsh whiskies. And I also offer to you the Glenfiddich Experimental Series Fire and Cane and Laphroaig's 10-year, both of which are Scotch. Okay, so just like your last whiskey tasting session, I have provided to you today a Glencairn glass. You'll see it in front of you. It will look just like this. And as previously mentioned, this will allow the aromas and flavours to be swirled, and as they rise to the surface you will get a complex family of flavours and aromas to enjoy from it. So I've also provided to you a standard whiskey tasting glass, a glass of whiskey stouts, some ice, and a small cup of water. For whiskies today, such as our Laphroaig, we would highly suggest you add just a touch of water to that, but we will get to that when it arises. So, we're going to begin today with the Scotch whiskies to my side here. So the whiskies that we have decided to show off for this session is the Glenfiddich Fire and Cane and the very classic Islay Laphroaig 10-year single malt whiskey. But before we dive into trying those whiskies, I'd like to let you know a little bit about the requirements needed to create Scottish whisky, as well as the 5 regions that Scotch is made in. Okay, so Scotch whisky must contain a minimum alcohol strength by volume of 40% alcohol by volume. It must be produced in Scotland from water and malted barley, to which only whole grains of other cereals can be added. It must be distilled at an alcoholic strength by volume of less than 94.8%. It must be fermented at that distillery only by adding yeast. It must be processed at that distillery into a mash, and it must be wholly matured in an excise warehouse in Scotland in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 litres for at least 3 years. And it must retain the colour, aroma and taste of the raw materials used to create that whisky. So there are 5 regions which are famous for creating Scotch. They are Speyside, the Highlands, the Lowlands, Campbelltown and Islay. And depending on where you purchase your whisky from Scotland, the flavours of those particular whiskies can be noted back to the specific region. So I'll explain a little bit more to you about those regions. So the first region I would like to talk about is Speyside. They produce the most whisky of the 5 Scottish whisky regions, and they are home to companies such as Glenfiddich, Glenmoray, the Macallan, Johnnie Walker and Glenlivet. 50% of Scottish whisky is produced there, and there are over 50 distilleries in that specific region alone. Because there are so many distilleries there, it is hard to pinpoint an exact flavour profile that region is famous for. But the predominant flavours from that area include smoky, vanilla, apple, and nutmeg. Next is the Highlands. Geographically, it is the largest whisky producing area, covering areas such as Aberdeen, Inverness, and Dundee. There are 30 distilleries in the Highlands, and they are more spread out than in Speyside, as it is a larger area. This area is known for medium body whiskies and is home to companies such as the Dalmore, Ben Nevis, Oban, and Aberfeldy. As the Highlands is a large area, like Speyside, again, it is difficult to pinpoint a specific flavour profile for that region too, but predominant and notable flavours from the Highlands include dried fruit, peat, honey, and it tends to be a bit more of a dry-bodied whisky. Next is the Lowlands. The Lowlands doesn't have many distilleries. Currently, it only has 3 active operating distilleries in the area. The whiskies here, though, are known to use little to no peat during their process. This area is famous, though, for their triple distillery method, famous in Irish whiskies. This increases the alcohol content but leaves the final whisky to be lighter, and it removes oily components and protein from the whisky. Notable flavours from this area, however, include floral tones, sweet notes, toffees, spices like cinnamon. The 4th area that produces Scotch in Scotland is Campbelltown. This is a western coastal town that used to be the hub of Scottish distilling. However, due to the American prohibition and overproduction, sales were hit very hard in this area. There are currently only 3 active distilleries in this area. They are Glen-Scotia, Glengyle, and Springbank. Despite the small amount of distilleries in Campbelltown, many note the area to be one of the most important zones of Scotch production due to its enormous impact on the whisky industry overall. Notable flavours from this area do include smoke, fruit, toffee, and vanilla. And the last, but certainly not the least in these regions, is Islay. Islay is a small island off of the west coast of Scotland and is only 25 miles long, but it contains 9 distilleries. It is nicknamed the Whisky Island. Their whisky is famous for packing a punch, as they tend to use high quality peat during their process. The peat there is soiled and made of decayed moss matter. Their whiskies are oily, and you'll find distilleries like Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Laphroaig here. The level of smokiness a Scotch achieves is determined by the time and type of smouldering peat the barley is exposed to during the drying process. The peat on Islay is fed by constant rain and sea spray, which adds to the strong, smoky, and salty seaweed taste. Notable flavours from this specific area include brine, seawood, salt, and smoke. So those are the 5 specific Scotch regions of Scotland. So the first whisky that I invite you to sample and explore today is Glenfiddich's Fire and Cane whisky. This is 43% alcohol by volume. So Glenfiddich is a Speyside single malt whisky, and it's produced by William Grant and Sons in the Scottish burgh of Dufftown in Moray. And Glenfiddich translates from Valley of the Deer in Gaelic. The distillery was founded in 1888 by William Grant in Dufftown, Scotland, in the glen of the River Fiddich. The American prohibition in the 1920s had an astounding effect on the whisky industry, collapsing several distilleries. However, Glenfiddich was one of the few distilleries to increase production during this time. Glenfiddich was one of the first whisky companies to market single malt whisky as a premium product, with the introduction in 1963 of their single malt to the United States and foreign markets. Glenfiddich is managed still by the family. It is currently managed by the 5th generation of William Grant's descendants. So, Fire and Cane is the 4th of 4 experimental whiskies by Glenfiddich. The other 3 are Project XX, India Pale Ale Cask, and Winter Storm. This one was released in August of 2018. It is a no age statement, light peated whiskey that is a blend of peated and non-peated whiskey, both first matured in ex-bourbon barrels. It is then finished in ex-Latin rum casks. It has a mash bill of 100% barley, and this whiskey happens to be a particular treat as Glenfiddich does not make peated whiskies very often, so this is really nice to see Glenfiddich introduce a little bit more of a peat whiskey to the market. They have dabbled with peat whiskies before, but it is not what they are specifically known for. So this is a nice treat to sample. To create their specific malted barley, they steep it in water for 2 days and allow it to germinate for 5 days. And this turns the natural starch into sugar. The result is a green malt that is dried over fire and then creates their malted barley. So now let's have a look at this whiskey. So this has a beautiful medium amber appearance to it. It has a complex and layered scent to it. There is slight peat, toffee, spice, and sweet notes of fruit. There are light notes simmering around in there of vanilla, graham cracker, cocoa. What do you think? So let's try this one now. You can feel free to sample this one as you please in any fashion, or you may feel free to pass on it. There is a dry, oaky smoke taste initially. Candied apples seem to be coming through. There's fruit and delicate notes of honey throughout. There's char and floral notes. It has a medium mouthfeel to it, but it's very velvety and it does sink into the teeth and tongue with great ease. The finish here is lingering and long-lasting. The peatiness of this one really comes out at the end there, with caramel, char, and a light touch of spice. What do you think of this one? Interesting. Very interesting. So now we're going to be moving on to the Laphroaig 10-year. So the Laphroaig 10-year is a 40% alcohol by volume Islay Scotch. It is made from 100% malted barley, and it is named after the area of land at the top of Loch Laphroaig on the south coast of the island of Islay. It was established in 1815 by Donald and Alexander Johnston. The duo originally raised cattle on their fields, but with an overproduction of barley that they fed to the cattle, they decided to create whiskey with the spare barley that they had, thus creating Laphroaig. They originally came from the Scottish clan Donald. Now, Donald did eventually buy out Alexander's share of the company for £350, and he became the sole owner. Alexander went on to spend a very long life in Australia. A few years after Donald collected the entire ownership of Laphroaig, he did pass away in 1847 after apparently falling into a vat of partially made whisky, which was rather unfortunate. So the company was left to Sandy Johnson's nephew, Ian Hunter. As Ian Hunter passed away childless, it was then moved to one of the managers called Bessie Williamson. Ian Hunter was responsible for a large portion of the growth of Laphroaig. He was in part credited as the man who introduced Laphroaig to America during the Prohibition, so that the single smoky malt could be sold for medicinal purposes, which I assume is one of the reasons that Laphroaig remained successful. In the 1960s, it was sold to Long John International, which was a Scottish distillery. After trading hands several times, Laphroaig finally settled under the ownership of Beam in 2014. Interestingly, Laphroaig has been the only whisky to carry the royal warrant of the Prince of Wales, which was awarded to the distillery during a visit in 1994. Laphroaig call themselves the most richly flavoured of all Scotch whisky. They typically age their drinks for 10 years, but they also make an 18-year, a 27, a 30, and a 40-year. The majority of Laphroaig's whiskies have a distinct peaty, smoky flavour to them, and to create this flavour they dry the malted barley over a peat fire. Laphroaig's ex-master distiller suggests that the only malt to be paired with water is the Laphroaig 10-year. So now let's have a look at the Laphroaig whisky. So I would certainly suggest taking the advice of Laphroaig's ex-master distiller by adding just a small few drops of water to the Laphroaig 10-year, should you wish to try this one. Yes, it can even enhance the aromas, so even by adding the water, even before smelling it, will change the scent profile. So I want to advise you on this one. This is a very unique whisky. It is extremely smoky and peaty. Some can find it to be quite overwhelming on the first taste and the first sniff, which is why the water is recommended. I also feel that the warning is necessary. Okay. So there is a beautiful burnished gold colour to this one, and I'm really going to swirl this one with the water. I have added just a few drops of water to this. Many people recommend not adding too much water should you want to add water to whiskey. There is a fine balance between enhancing the flavours and aromas and just drowning them. So you only want to add just a few drops to enhance the whiskey experience. So I'm going to really swirl on this one. And even with adding those small drops of water and giving it a nice sturdy swirl, big, hefty, breathy notes of smoky peat fly right out. There is so much spice and licorice in this one. hefty notes of salt here and a cool wood smoke. It is, in my opinion at least, one of the most powerful whiskies that I have ever come across, at least in terms of its aroma, so I am quite curious to hear what you think of the aroma of this one. Yes, this one does take a little bit of time to embrace and to really cut through some of those more complex layers inside it in the aroma. So I now invite you to try this particular whiskey. You can feel free to try it exactly as it is with some water, or you may feel free to pass on it however you please. Okay. Initially, very powerful peaty notes, quite like the scent. Big flavour profile of seaweed. Whilst this whiskey does not appear initially as a complex drink, because of its very long finish, many flavours and layers come through with this one. So you need to give it a little bit of time for those flavours to really come to the surface. There are very gentle hints of vanilla with this one, but very strong peppery notes. One notable flavour that a lot of people tend to agree on is a salty flavour, as well as a little bit of a medicinal taste to it. What do you think? So those tarry notes build right up to the end there, and given some time to air out, be swirled around and have a little bit of water added to it, once this whiskey relaxes and tempers, it is much easier to embrace. It's a very interesting opinion. So now we're going to be moving on to our 2 Welsh whiskies for today's tasting session. So are you familiar with Welsh whisky at all? Welsh whisky has, I would say, an abandoned but extremely long history. Creating whisky in Wales actually dates back all the way to the Middle Ages, with evidence of its creation dating back to the 4th century AD. The production of Welsh whisky declined, however, in the 19th century, with the commercial development of liquor being discouraged by the rise of the temperance movement. The temperance movement was a social movement which campaigned against the recreational use and sale of alcohol, and it promoted total abstinence. Whisky production in Wales was non-existent for almost 100 years between the 20th and 21st century. The first attempt at revitalising the Welsh whisky industry began in the 1990s, where Scottish blends were bottled in Wales and they claimed it to be Welsh whisky. A lawsuit, however, ended that very short bout. Penderyn, the company right next to me, which was originally called the Welsh Whisky Company, successfully began revitalising the Welsh whisky industry in the year 2000. The distillery was built in Penderyn in the Brecon Beacons National Park, South Wales. Production commenced in 2000, and the finished product, the first whisky commercially produced in Wales, went on sale in 2004, where it has remained a success ever since. I believe that Penderyn has about 3 distilleries in Wales at this point. Due to Penderyn's very brave, bold step into the abandoned Welsh whisky industry, they paved the way for now 4 distilleries to be currently operating in Wales. The most recent of which comes from Aberfour's distillery in Abergwyngern, who released their first whisky in May of 2021. So a little bit of history about Penderyn now. They have a fantastic and unique process for their whiskies that I would invite you to listen to a little bit more about. Penderyn uses copper pot stills to create their whisky. Whilst many Scottish and Irish distilleries use a 2 or 3 pot lantern still system, Wales opts for individual pot stills for a clean and flavourful spirit. This is called the Faraday still, named after its creator. The still works by producing different grades of alcohol using a single fractionating column. The majority of Scotch single malt is distilled twice in pot stills, and the spirit made from it sits at around 65 to 70% alcohol. However, with Penderyn's very unique system with their stills, they are able to achieve 92% alcohol with just one still. This removes many of the unwanted parts of the whisky out and keeps the whisky light and distinctly flavourful. However, they haven't neglected the Scottish and Irish system of pot stills, and in 2014 they commissioned a pair of Scottish-style lantern stills to allow them to experiment with new whiskies. These style of stills create a more oily spirit, and Penderyn have experimented by blending their Faraday style whisky with their lantern style still whisky. All of the distilling process is controlled by an all-women team too. So this whisky is married with water from the Brecon Beacons. For the wood, Penderyn uses a variety of different casks depending on which whisky they make. For the initial maturation, they use bourbon casks, typically from Buffalo Trace and Evan Williams. Evan Williams actually once had a distillery in Wales at one point, so it's a nice collaboration between them. Their whisky is aged in charred oak barrels to remove undesirable chemical compounds, as the charcoal created as oak barrels are burned or charred prior to filling acts as a filter. Penderyn creates several spirits, including gin and whisky. These 2 whiskies are actually part of a trio called Celt, Myth and Legend. Today you are being invited to sample Myth and Legend. This is called their Dragon series. So first we're going to be having a look at Myth, which is this one right here. Myth is a single malt whisky finished in a range of selected ex-bourbon and rejuvenated oak casks, and it has a mash bill of 100% malted barley. So let's have a look at this one now. So the colour on this one is hay-like, I would say. Very pretty and elegant. I found that from sampling these whiskies, they tend to have a little bit more of a lighter introduction to them. With a lot of newcomers when it comes to whisky, they experience a lot of peatiness, smoke and spice, and that can be a little bit of an overwhelming introduction to whisky, regardless of the percent of alcohol in them. But I find that because this one is so light on the mouth and on the nose, it is a really nice, almost refreshing whisky, but also nice as a newcomer's whisky. This one is a 41% alcohol by volume whisky for the UK, but for the United States this is 43% alcohol by volume. So the nose on this one is malt, toffee, almond, some fruits. What do you think of this one? So let's try this now. Again, I invite you to try this as you please, or you may feel free to pass on it, whatever you're comfortable with. Beautiful flavours of cocoa, malt, citrus, spice flowing around with this one. There is char that I can taste and delicate notes of vanilla. It has a medium body to it. The finish here is medium to long, with the fruit, spice and malt really lingering at the end there. What do you think of this one? Interesting. It's a very interesting take. So at this point, Penderyn has won over 50 awards for their whiskies. For Myth specifically, they have won a gold from the San Francisco World Spirits Awards in 2022. So now let's move on to our final whiskey for this whiskey tasting session. So the last whiskey that I invite you to try today is Penderyn's Legend. So this one again is a 41% alcohol by volume whiskey in the UK and 43% alcohol by volume in the United States. I'm unsure as to why they have done this, so that is something I will have to discover. So this one is a Madeira finish single malt whiskey. It is matured in ex-bourbon casks made from American oak before receiving a further maturation in oak barriques that previously held Madeira wine. This develops a harmonious flavour with soft and sophisticated flavours with soft golden hues, according to Penderyn. So, having a look at the colour of this one, it's a beautiful amber colour to it, with golden tones flowing throughout. This doesn't require much swirling or any water to be added, at least in my opinion, to really open up those aromas. I think they flow quite naturally by themselves. A lot of fresh, beautiful scents coming from this one. Apples, a beautiful creamy fudge, just mingling itself in there with the fruits. Sultana raisins. This complex, clean, well-balanced fusion of aromas here. Butterscotch and very, very slight spice right at the tail end there. What do you think? Well, I invite you to try this one now in any fashion that you please, but again, you may feel free to pass on it if you like. Okay. A very, very delicate, sweet, almost slightly bitter taste to this one. There is a combination of fresh fruit flavours infused with this one, as opposed to dried spice. The finish on this one is certainly long, paving the way for that beautiful, almost Madeira cake flavour right at the end. The scent of that creamy fudge and fruity notes and butterscotch really flow so well into the palate, inviting a very similar experience, but of course more intense. This is a very, very fine whiskey. So what did you think of this particular whiskey? Interesting, very interesting. So this one actually won a double gold in 2021 from the 50 Best World Whiskies. So that is the 4 whiskies for this tasting session. What did you think of the whiskies overall? Okay. And are there any that surprised you? Okay. I meant to show you, by the way, that the Dragon series actually lines up perfectly. I don't have the Celt box here with me, but I will show you the Myth and Legend boxes. So the Welsh flag has a red dragon on it. It looks just like this. And if you line the boxes up perfectly, you create the Welsh dragon. The dragon is also wrapped around the box. But I'll just grab this box for you. You can put the boxes side by side to create the dragon. I have not seen the Celt box in person, but I assume it would take the tail on this side here. You can also show the boxes off like this if you prefer, but the boxes are very gorgeous and charming. I thought it would have been such a waste to not show you the boxes for the tasting session today. The Laphroaig box is also beautiful, with its very delicate finish on the front and the wrapping around it. And I actually have the Fire and Cane box here, which you can get the Glenfiddich placed in. It's a very, very pretty box with the gold decorations on the front here. Welsh whiskies and Scotch sometimes like to present themselves in really sophisticated ways, not only in the bottling, but in the packaging on the exterior of the bottle. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this whiskey tasting session, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on the whiskies with us. So, feel free to look forward to our future whiskey tasting sessions that we will have here, and we will email you nearer the time when they are to happen. Well, thank you very much for visiting us today. Take care. Goodbye.